Unlocked is brought to you by Invincible, a program designed to unlock the potential of people and teams inside your organization. Join companies like Pfizer, Delta, the CDC, Google, and Chick-fil-A, and others in over 116 countries that are currently using this program to increase productivity and develop healthy cultures. Access hundreds of hours of content that is accessible anytime, anywhere. And finally, use real-time data to understand the health of every team inside your organization, which teams are performing and which ones aren't. Then understand the why behind that performance. Get free access to Invincible for 30 days by visiting www.giant.tv/30days. Hi, welcome to another episode of Unlocked. Today, we're going to talk about a very important topic, and it involves unlocking the potential of people. Yes, that is what we talk about on this show. And today it's very important. It's not only unlock the potential of people, but society as a whole and where we're going with this very important topic. So I've got an expert on the show. I'm going to call him an expert because not only does he live DE&I, but he works in DE&I, he breathes DE&I. And the idea of belonging is so crucial, so much that he wrote a book called Imagine Belonging, and his website is imaginebelonging.com. So Rhodes Perry is on the show. Rhodes from Rhodes Perry Consulting. Okay, check this out. Best-selling author, keynote speaker, podcast host, social entrepreneur. He's a LinkedIn learning instructor of the course Building an LGBTQ plus inclusive organization. He has had 20 years of experience. He's worked in the White House. He's worked in the Department of Justice. He's worked for PFLAG National, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Associated Press have all featured his work. He's serves on the National LGBTQ plus Chamber of Commerce's Transgender Inclusion Task Force and Cascade's AIDS Project's Board of Directors. And he's also on the University of Notre Dame Alumni Association's Rainbow Community Task Force. So he's got a couple things going on. He's got some credibility, I think, unless he's been faking it this whole time, but this guy doesn't fake it. And you'll be able to tell in our interview. Very important. We talk about his book, about the idea around his book, Imagine Belonging, what belonging means, and some of the crucial things that are happening in our workforce that need to change, and how we can bring about this idea of belonging and all the things that we're trying to do right now. He has some amazing things that he brings to the table here. Here we come, Rhodes. Let's go. Rhodes, welcome to the show. Good to have you.
It's great to be here, Scott. Thank you.
This is a very important topic. My audience has heard the D&I topic a few times here in the past, but I want to make sure that I'm capturing different perspectives and coming from different sources, because I think everybody has a place, something to add here. And that's something I learned in my own DE&I journey as facilitating different groups like this, is that, even I need a place at the table, right? I mean, granted, as a middle-aged white male, I have a place naturally at that table, but it's important that we all are represented because we all have a responsibility. So, I'm going right into this thing. Slow down, Scott. Rhodes, tell us about your journey. Tell us about how you landed where you are right now and why this is such an important topic for you.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a big question, and I'm not quite sure where to start because I feel like this kind of work is a lifelong journey, and much of my work in focus is around this idea of belonging, right? And it can feel a little elusive for some of your listeners, where it's like, I've heard this belonging concept as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I don't quite understand where it fits. And I think for me, the reason why I feel so called to do this work is that I've had a lot of experiences of exclusion, right? And kind of the sting of it, of social exclusion. So a little bit about myself for your listeners. I'm a white person, a white transgender queer guy, right? So I carry a lot of privilege when it comes to race and ethnicity. And at the same time, right, like many of us, we can be a little bit of a contradiction where we hold power and privilege in some spaces, and in other spaces we don't. And I think the pieces around being trans and being queer has really influenced, obviously, my life, certainly my career. So kind of early jobs that I had, one of the first jobs I had, I was working at the Department of Justice. I've worked at the White House. I've worked in a lot of these kind of government institutions and really cool opportunities. Yet I often found myself being one of the only, if not the only people being trans or queer, and just trying to like raising my hand when I felt safe enough to do so. And many times I didn't. We can talk about that. But just, trying to kind of make these spaces built for more people that aren't from total dominant identities, right? So in this instance, organizations built for people who aren't trans, right? And there's some pretty significant barriers. So anyway, just kind of getting started in my career in organizations that weren't fully inclusive, fully welcoming, and being willing to kind of engage in that work, even though it wasn't a part of my job at that time, to try to make those organizations not only better for me, but for people like me that come later on, right? So kind of dropping that ladder down, which is super important. I got involved while working in kind of government. I got involved in the LGBTQ social justice movement. That was in the early aughts, and I eventually ended up being a policy director for a national LGBTQ organization, working on employment rights and employment inclusion. And that was awesome. It was during the Obama administration. So we had a lot of access to sharing with government leaders how different agencies, whether agencies employing people or delivering services to different communities, had a long way to go to be more inclusive of LGBTQ folks, especially at the intersections of other kind of marginalized identities. So being Black, Indigenous, a person of color who's LGBTQ, or an LGBTQ person with a disability, right? Like trying to see that we're not just kind of one aspect of our identity, but we're many things. And when we carry different marginalized identities, it becomes challenging, to really show up and feel like you can share those things that are most precious about who you are to people that are your colleagues, and you're not sure how they're going to receive that information. And so sometimes, oftentimes, 75% of us, and even those of us who hold like the most enfranchised identities, find ourselves hiding or covering the things that are most precious to us on the job. And what that ultimately results in is it's a tax, it's an emotional tax, where about 20% of your brain is just negotiating, can I share this aspect of who I am? And if I do, is there going to be a negative consequence? Will I not get that promotion? Will I miss out on a stretch opportunity? Can I lose my job? And so many times we hide those things that can create real connections with our colleagues. And anyway, that inspired me to ultimately start my own business about 10 years ago, to really support leaders, executive teams, thinking about consciously the kind of culture that they have, even if it's hard to look at, and how to shift that so that it reduces harm, and a lot of times unintentional harm, to their employees, to the people that they're serving, and getting them curious about what the benefits are in doing this work, which is a lot of thinking. It's a lot of being intentional and then implementation. So what are those benefits, and what are the costs of doing nothing? And usually where I start with leaders is who are we intentionally including, right? And who might we be unintentionally excluding? And that second part of the question usually scares people to be like, well, how would we know that? And that becomes the work. And it's I find it to be really rewarding. A lot of times it's kind of planting seeds for people, even if they're not quite ready to do the work. It's getting them to start to really consider experiences beyond their own, and it can be really powerful. So that's probably more than you more than you asked for, but hopefully
It
that's
was
helpful.
good. No, that was perfect. The personal side of that is I mean, if everybody could go into a line of work they feel personally responsible for, personally motivated by, because of something that happened in their lives that, either positively or negatively impacted them in a way that was was drawn into their purpose, holy moly, this world would be on fire, right? But we don't all get that opportunity. So um awesome. Like that piece of that shows us why you're doing what you're doing,
Yeah.
and making it personal. So let's talk about, so the name of your company, the name of your new book is called Imagine Belonging.
Yeah.
It's not just called belonging, right? It's Imagine Belonging. So tell me about that context. What is that about? What is the imagine part? How does that play a role?
Yeah. It's, well, one, it's giving us permission to really think about how our workplace culture can be different than what it is right now, and not being cynical and not going into that self-sabotaging belief of, well, there's no way that no matter where I sit in my organization, have any ability to change it. So it's one, let's leaning into that space, but two, it gets at one of the common reasons why our culture transformation, culture change, diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments, whatever you want to call it, why these goals often tend to stall out, stymie, or ultimately fail. And it's that lack of a long-term vision of where you want to go, right? So if you know what you're up against, that's number one, the biggest challenge is like, what are we up against? What is this implicit culture that just is? And we don't even bother to name what it is and how it may be causing harm. But two, if we recognize that it is causing harm and we want to transform it, what are we running towards? And getting really clear about that. What does your culture of the future look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Full sensory level for you to experience that and to lean into the imagination part of what would change for you? What would change for how you lead the people that you manage? And most importantly, what would change for people furthest removed from your position of power, those people that are least likely to even feel safe showing up to work each and every day? So that's why I wrote the book, because I feel like in this work, especially right now, there's many organizations that are signing up, making commitments to be an anti-racist organization, to be a fully inclusive organization of people that aren't necessarily represented at that highest level of leadership. And yet there's a lot of actions that are happening, but it doesn't, at least with the clients and the people that I work with, it takes a while to have a kind of like a vision of where you're going and how these actions strategically move you in that direction, rather than just doing a whole bunch of activities to say you're doing something, but not being really clear of your why and what the kind of transformation is that you seek. So that's a little bit about the book.
Good. So give me the contents of it. So what's in there?
Yeah, definitely. So there's 4 parts of it. And the first part is really looking at culture. The second part is looking at how you lead. The third part is looking at how you build teams. And the last part is how you structure work. And within each part of the book, it's naming kind of what is or what you're up against. The second part is looking at possibilities. So things that are already happening in workplaces that are doing this work really well. And then the third part or the third chapter of each part is then pushing you to really examine what can you do given where you're at to make to use your influence to make some kind of change, to make some kind of commitment, ultimately to make some kind of transformation. And something that I distinguish in the book that I think is really important is we're not just trying to change, right? Like change is something that is reversible, right? Like I could change my mind. I could change the route that I take to walk every morning. I could change the kind of car I drive, whatever, like a change is something reversible. Whereas a transformation is something where we become something that we've never been before and we're never going back. So as an adult, I imagine most of your audience is adults, like just think about the fact you're never going to go back to being a baby, right? Like you've ultimately transformed, you continue to transform. So you have to let go of what you once were to become what you're destined to be, right? And so when we think about status quo workplaces, we think about, this new normal, we're never going to go back to the way things used to be. That's great. And I think an organizational culture that has caused so much harm for so many of us who have been historically excluded, we definitely don't want to go back to the way things were. We don't just want to change. So we're not talking about like change management. This is like transformation management. And I think that intentionality behind the words that we use really does matter. And it also shifts our mindset. So that's something else that's really underscored in the book.
I love that. So thank you so much, Rhodes. We're going to end the interview right now, and I'm going to take that idea and run with it. Appreciate it. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay.
No, that was so good.
Yeah.
No, that was so good. I really love that thought. So thanks for the nugget. That's really powerful. And I hope people wrote that down. And that mind shift is really interesting when you think about that. So tell me about this idea of permission and why that's so important in this day and age.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that sometimes we just accept things the way that they are, sometimes because of our own experience. And so I just want to acknowledge for many of your listeners, maybe, the experience in the workplace has been, it's never been safe for me to share anything about who I am. I just show up, I do my job, I go home. I don't really have kind of those trusting relationships that I have like in my community or with my family, friends, et cetera. So that's hard. It's hard to imagine something that you've never personally experienced. And maybe for those folks that do feel like the workplace is fine the way that it is, right? I think you have to give yourself permission to lean into being a little vulnerable, of recognizing what you don't know, and trying to be empathetic to what you're learning about your colleagues, learning about the people that you lead and manage, where they're telling you, they're giving you a gift of feedback of, this is really harmful, like the way that things are structured in the workplace. This is really challenging. So we have to give ourselves permission to be open. One, to, if we've never experienced this, like try to just name what it could be like. And for those of us that do experience a strong sense of belonging at work, to give ourselves permission to being a little bit vulnerable, being empathetic of other experiences, and using that feedback to be the best version of yourself as a leader, and to build the best possible organization that's going to limit harm, right? And it's going to do good. And I know that you talk with a lot of entrepreneurs and small business leaders. This is what matters, right? I'm sure many of you all have heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, it's true, right? And if you're not thinking about culture in the same way as you're thinking about cash flow and operations, you may run the risk of what many bigger corporations are experiencing right now, which is a lot of pushback from staff and many employees to saying, look, I don't want to be here anymore. I have opportunities elsewhere, and this organization I'm good for the organization, but this isn't good for me. And I think as business leaders, we never want to get in that position, right now, where we're trying to stand out, being employers of choice, and really attracting that really amazing talent, especially with younger people coming into the workforce that don't want to sacrifice who they are and the things that are most precious to them. They want to show up, they want to be seen for who they are, and like just do their zone of genius. So what are ways, that your audience can really consider, what are the things that I can do to really transform my culture in a way where I can really stand out as an employer that's doing things a little bit different. And the really cool thing is with smaller businesses that, like, a lot of businesses are recognizing that value of, we're mission driven, we've got a purpose, right? And that kind of thinking often comes out of nonprofits, but it's great to see that that's been, there's a growing movement and kind of for-profit business to really consider what's our mission and what's our values, and really trying to find employees that are value add. They're not just going to fit in with a culture that isn't serving anybody. It's causing a lot of harm.
So Brene Brown, I was listening to her podcast a little while ago. I don't know if you listened to the one where they had these researchers on that just published a paper about the Great Resignation. And Do you remember? Did you listen to that by chance? They
Not
had go back and listen to that. It was really interesting. If you they analyzed, I think it was 1,600 different companies
yeah.
about the reasons, why people were leaving, and they listed five of them. Some were about respect, some were about dominating cultures, or I guess kind of trying to jump over other people, right? Cutthroat culture, right? But if I'm correct, and I could be wrong, but the number one thing was the inattention and the not emphasizing diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
Which that would have not been the reason 10 years ago. It was so interesting to me that was part of it. And it's a wake-up call for a lot of the organizations out there. You're speaking to it right now, right? It needs to become part of the conversation.
Mhm.
And it doesn't just need to be this like, oh, everybody's saying we got to do it, so let's do whatever the bare minimum it is to make sure that we cross the line, or that we can say that we're doing that. But what do you consider, I guess, the biggest obstacle to companies adopting that philosophy and that mindset?
Yeah, I think the biggest obstacle outside of that lack of that long-term vision is ill-equipped leaders that aren't accountable, right? So, and what I mean by that is ill-equipped leaders lacking those skills of leading inclusively, right? And in my book, I talk a lot about what some of those skills are, right? And just as we talked about vulnerability, Brene Brown, boom, like expert there, empathy, adaptability, the ability to engage in both and thinking, right? So it's moving away from this, there's only two options. And unfortunately, those kind of skills that I spend a lot of my time equipping leaders with are labeled as soft skills. These are skills that, these are nice to have. That ability to really listen to someone else, that's a nice skill to have. But we need effective leadership on implementing operation plan and things of that nature. It's I think if that's the mindset, that's pretty dangerous, because we are moving into a world where these kind of quote unquote soft skills, I call them essential skills, are the things that are going to allow your business to survive. Just on that piece of adaptable leadership alone. If you don't have that ability to be okay with change, if you don't have that ability to be okay with making mistakes and messiness, that's an environment where there could be a penalty of taking risk. And I know, like, you do talk with entrepreneurs, so there's probably an audience that's like open to engaging in high risks, which is great, right? But we need that kind of risk taking, and not to penalize people for making mistakes, asking for help when they need it, offering constructive feedback. Those are all signals that if you can do that without fear of negative consequence, that you're in a psychologically safe environment. Unfortunately, though, I think a lot of organizations don't have that level of safety, particularly for historically excluded employees and talent. And that's a big problem. So I think ill-equipped leaders, and then not being accountable. So say you establish diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments, right? And maybe there's a strategy around it, but there isn't an operations plan. There isn't something around implementation and metrics, right? And the thing that I find really frustrating, right? Like if you had, say you changed your IT system in your company, at the end of the day what success is going to look like. When that IT system is fully functioning, operational, what that's going to look like. You have milestones to get there to make that change. And there's someone or maybe a team that's responsible for making that happen. And you evaluate them based on whether they got that job, they got the result, right? And high functioning organizations that have a chief diversity officer, they have staff, they have metrics, and they also require other executives to play a part in doing this work. They have some accountability there. Unfortunately, a lot of the companies, like you said, that are just like, oh, I guess we should do this, they're checking a box. Maybe they do an unconscious bias training. Maybe they come up with a DEI vision statement, and that's it. That's where they stop. And that's not only is that going to lead to failure, it causes a lot of harm for employees that get excited to see like, oh, we're going to do this. We're going to try to shift. We're going to try to transform our culture. And then after a year, particularly when executives say, well, what was all of that for? We didn't get anything, nothing changed. And then they abandon the work. That's where a lot of people, potentially can leave. And I'm not surprised in that report that you cited. Number one reason is, like lack of DEI commitments, not seeing those commitments get implemented in any real way that changes the experiences of people that are kind of the first to be harmed in the workplace.
Powerful. Yeah, there's a definite movement, a definite shift happening. And if you aren't on board, you're getting left behind. And there's the shift to the power of the employee is there now, right? They are no longer held by the golden handcuffs or by whatever's holding them to that company. If they don't agree with your belief system, if they don't align with your vision, of what you have, and if that vision doesn't align with mine, I'm going to go somewhere else. There are so many opportunities out there, and a lot of companies are relying on the short-term dopamine hit of money and benefits to try to get you on. But that's not what gets you to stay.
Yeah.
You build loyalty through consistency, credibility, authenticity, and that level of trust, and then doing good things with that trust to build loyalty over time. And that's where the oxytocin, serotonin, the serotonin, like those things fill us with trust that we want to be loyal to that organization over time, because we see it. We see the investment they're making, and not only me, but in society as a whole. So your book is just a reflection of your, I say just, I don't mean it in that way, right? Is a reflection of your mind, the work you do. Can you give me an example? And I know it's kind of on the fly. So of some of the work you've done that has resulted in something that was transformative, something that, I know transformation takes a while, right? I get it. But something where you could start to see that little nugget of hope come out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that in some of the engagements, and one of the more recent engagements that I've done, and this is a client I've worked with for probably the past 4 years, is a very large hospital system, like 16,000 employees, so massive, right? And they recognized, and this was before the pandemic, before the racial and social justice uprisings of 2020, right? They recognized that there's a significant need to make change, right? And they wanted to come up with DEI commitments. They had nothing. They had no infrastructure. They had a lot of resources. And so I think the transformation one was getting their CEO and getting the executive team to recognize they're a part of being accountable to make this change, and to start to do the work of going beyond just, we have to do this because we're getting pushed. We're getting pushed by, our donors. We're getting pushed by our clients. We're getting pushed by our caretakers. We need to have a more clear why about what the kind of transformation we want. And they engaged in that work, and I think part of that transformation, and this is the type of work I really like to do with executive teams, is one, getting them to know the kind of culture that they have, right? And that in and of itself is to name the things that are taking place that are causing a lot of harm. And I use the work of Temo Kun and Kenneth Jones, which uses traits of white supremacy culture, which can be kind of shocking for a lot of executives that are not familiar with that vernacular. Kind of like nonverbal body language can kind of tighten up. You talked about some of those happy hormones. We see the opposite of adrenaline and cortisol of like, but I start with that because that's what we swim in, whether or not we want to acknowledge that, at least in a US context, in most kind of larger organizations. So getting them comfortable, not comfortable, getting them like maybe uncomfortable of recognizing that this is in their organization, it's in our culture. And what do we do about that? Just in terms of, if we want to shift things and we want to build a more inclusive culture, a more equitable culture, how do we move away from that? And how do we start to embrace different traits, different values, and getting them to recognize, right? Like one, and I love this definition by Trabian Shorters, which is culture is the transferable set of beliefs and behaviors that allows a social group to survive, right? Just allowing a social group to survive. And if we're not careful inside of our organizations, if we don't name the kind of culture that we have, we're going to continue to pass these traits and behaviors down from the next generation of leaders coming in particular to that executive team. So working with this particular group, getting them to then name some of the antidotes to those traits of white supremacy culture. And I offer a framework that's called the belonging culture traits. And so, rather than perfectionism, which I think, we talk about, we want an organization of excellence, right? And so one of those traits of white supremacy culture is, if we make a mistake, it's not just that we made a mistake, it's that we are a mistake. And that's awful, right? Like, it's probably the worst thing as a human is to feel that when, like, we're human, we're going to make mistakes. And those can actually lead to some really great insights, aha moments, and innovations, right? So moving to a culture of appreciation, like when we make a mistake, which we will, how do we create an environment for learning from that mistake? How do we openly say, guess what? Our team made this mistake. Let's talk through like what happened, what we can learn from it, and what we can do differently. And it's really cool. Like when I engage with this team, those kind of moments of like, oh, right. Like not only can we come up with new behaviors and beliefs, I would just say behaviors in this sense, but we can start to evaluate, when we bring in new talent, we can start to ask interview questions that interview around the kind of traits that we want to build up and equip our leaders with. And we can start to manage our talent like through, annual evaluations on if we're demonstrating these traits. And before we get there, we can equip leaders with these kind of traits that will start to make a difference in our organization. And they did that, and they're still doing that. And it takes, this is, we're planting seeds, right? So in just kind of traditional change management, if you're starting to make these kind of changes, you're not going to see consistent indicators of success until 10 to 20 years in the long run. And I think in a short-term culture that is all about instant gratification, it's really hard to manage the expectations, in particular of leaders making this kind of investment in the work. So managing those expectations too, I feel like was a big success because they're on a path and they know that it's not going to end after the first year of doing the work, that it's going to take 10 to 20 years. So what is that long-term commitment? And establishing some metrics to know that we're on that path. And if we're not, doing that course correction. And they've done that a few times. They've recognized, they're working with people. Everybody's at a different learning place. And even the organization itself, we talk about organizational readiness. What are they ready for now? And where can they be in the future? So just to kind of like end that, we started with not a whole lot of understanding of the culture, not really having infrastructure to do the work. Where they're at now, they have an entire department of leaders, with a peer on the executive team that's leading this work and visioning, but also evaluating staff on how they are doing this work based on their individual job responsibilities, being accountable, in small ways, right? But just kind of in those annual reviews of recognizing these are our goals, these are our values, and then including some of those questions on how are you contributing to building this kind of culture, right? And it's great to start to see movement, right? But I wish I could tell you, overnight there was radical transformation, but I wouldn't be doing a service to your audience. Like, if you're ready to do this work, be ready to do this work over the long haul, because that's what it takes. I've been running my own business for about 10 years. So I have yet to see a client 20 years through, but I will come back on your show and let you know more about like radical transformation. Though, as an example, if people are like, oh, I really want to see a case study, Sodexo is a really good example for like a massive global kind of multinational corporation that in the 80s was facing, I think it was the 80s or early 90s, a massive class action lawsuit around EEO violations around race and gender discrimination. And from that moment, part of their settlement was to engage in DEI work, culture transformation work, night and day to where they're at today. So just kind of take a look at that if people are skeptical, or if you want to see how does this really look over a matter of decades. And they're one of many kind of case studies like that really had a turnaround in a good way.
Very cool. Very cool. So you've been thinking about this a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, how can people get a hold of the book? Where do they get in touch with you? Give us the details.
Thanks. ImagineBelonging.com is the best way to get a hold of the book. If you're interested in my work, rhodesperry.com is a great place to find me. Always happy to chat, and very excited that this is a topic on your show and that you're focusing on it. It's the work of the future. And I encourage you, even if it feels a little scary, this is the work that matters, and it will make a world of difference for your employees, your future employees, and all of the people that you serve.
Thanks, Rhodes. Well said. Good luck with the book. Good luck with the work. You're doing something good.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me today.
This journey into belonging is not a short-term strategy. Okay. If you're looking to flip a company or whatever you're trying to do, and you think this is your ticket to do that, it's not. Okay. It takes time. It's costly. It takes time, takes energy, and it takes intentionality. And sometimes those are hard things to do, especially all at the same time. We need to change our mindset and transform our mindset. Yeah, you like that? So from this idea, he talked about it, right? We can change our clothes, we can change our car, we can change our mind. There's certain things we can change, and it's just about reverting back and forth and going. But when we transform, we evolve, we become something that we weren't before. And so how can we lean into this idea of not only transformation, but imagination? Lean into imagination. And that's, I don't know if that's a central core thing, but that's something I popped out of this conversation. I pulled that out of this conversation because that's so cool. Leaning into imagination. What could be? What is the potential of us and our organization? What's the cost of doing nothing? I think we've seen it. Based on that research I said from Brene Brown and the guests that she had on her show, belonging is a crucial piece of the Great Resignation. And if we're not paying attention to that, we have a problem. Who are we unintentionally excluding? I don't think, I would hope a majority of us are not trying to exclude people. Sometimes we may be, but I would hope that we're not. But sometimes, most of the time, in that situation, we may be unintentionally excluding them. And that can happen. How about ill-equipped leaders who aren't accountable? As probably what he mentioned, one of the biggest problems to bringing us forward in this whole movement is ill-equipped leaders who are unaccountable. And that is a problem as well. So how can we invest in our leadership? How can we invest in our people to make sure that they are equipped and make sure that they are held accountable to carry through on the things they say they're going to do? If you want to find out more about me, you can go to skotwaldron.com. I've got more resources on there, more of these shows, also more about how I'm transforming leaders and helping them evolve their cultures into, something that people want to belong to. And I am also on YouTube. I'm on LinkedIn. Like, subscribe, comment my YouTube channel. You'll find some free tools and resources there as well. And that's it. I guess I'll see you next time. Well, I hope I'll see you next time on another episode of Unlocked.